Hello. It was when Donald Trump said about video games that we can't allow our children to be growing up in an atmosphere of violence that I suddenly started to think of the legend of King Thoth and Thoth. I know that quite a few people have not heard of King Thoth and Thoth, so I'll explain. It was a story told by Socrates to his followers. Okay, Thoth, spelled Thoth, but modern academics say it's pronounced Thoth, so that's what I'm going to go with. Thoth was said to be the son of Ra. But there is an alternative legend to his beginnings as well, and that is that he created himself out of the power of magical language. Now, this story the story of Thoth is about 4,000 years old. And I think it's rather interesting that Thoth was created out of the word. Some of you biblical scholars might recognize that concept. Hold it in mind, because words are going to be very important, or the misuse of them rather, in this video. So this is the story of Thoth and Thoth. Socrates says, I heard that in Egypt was one of the ancient gods of that country, and the name of the god was Thoth. He it was who invented numbers and arithmetic and geometry and astronomy, and most important of all, letters, meaning writing. Now, the king of all Egypt at that time was the god Thoth, who lived in Thebes. To him came Thoth to show his inventions. When they came to the letters, Thoth said, This invention, O king, will make the Egyptians wiser. It's an elixir of memory and wisdom. But Thoth replied, Most ingenious Thoth, one man has the ability to beget arts, but the ability to judge of their usefulness or harmfulness belongs to another. That is, an inventor may invent something, but you can't tell where it's going to go, what sort of harm it can do. And now you, who are the father of letters, ascribe to them a power the opposite of that which they really possess. For this invention will produce forgetfulness in the minds of those who learn to use it, because they will not practice their memory. Their trust in writing, that is, external characters, things that aren't coming out of your own brain, will discourage the use of their own memory. You have invented an elixir not of memory, but of reminding. And you offer your pupils the appearance of wisdom, not true wisdom, for they will read many things without instruction, and will therefore seem to know many things, when they are for the most part ignorant and hard to get along with, since they are not wise, but only appear wise. So, what he's saying is that when people memorize things, they'll memorize only what they understand. That is, it's easier for you to remember something if you know what you're trying to remember. For example, I can memorize a poem in English relatively easily, but I'd have a lot more trouble memorizing one in Latvian, for instance. However, I could read a poem in Latvian, and I could even look like I understand what I'm saying. Thoth says that people will parrot facts they've read, but they won't understand what it's really about. And how many people do you know who do that? So he has some validity. However, there's a big hole in that argument as well. Because while we can see there's a detriment to writing things down, I don't think that anyone who's read any great literature or had to work out, something using Euclid, or you need a reference in an encyclopedia, I don't think anyone would dispute that writing is useful. But at the time from which that opinion emanates, writing was a new technology. And it was still by no means a universal one, even in the time of Socrates. Socrates went on to expand on this story. He was using it as an illustration that disputation and discussion were the best ways of acquiring knowledge, and that you couldn't get the full picture just by reading a book. He was missing a crucial point, though. We're not talking about one book, are we? Not us. We're talking about reading a lot of books, all with differing opinions and differing approaches. Socrates, because of the available technology at the time, which was next to nothing, and the restricted academic pool, was thinking only in terms of like one book per subject. That's the first thing. But the second point is possibly a bit more amusing. You see, Socrates had an investment in first-person discussion, didn't he? He never wrote anything down, as far as we know. As a matter of fact, now I come to think of it, I'm not even sure he could read, because he did never write. He didn't ever write anything down. Ironically enough, all we know about him was what Plato and Xenophon wrote about him afterwards. However, during his lifetime, people came from all over the known world to talk to him. If there'd been books, of course, far fewer would have bothered to make the journey. It was perilous and uncomfortable, but Socrates had a personal investment in face-to-face dialogue because of his students, and was therefore inclined, to look at the worst of writing things down, just like Abbot Johannes Trithemius thought about printing in the 16th century. He had no problem with writing, but he had an investment in monks who were doing the writing, so he said that printing would not only do the monks out of a job, but the sort of paper they used for printing wasn't as sturdy as parchment, for instance. You think of everything you can to show that this new technology is no good. There's also a lot of general talk about printing, in the 16th century, generally warping people's minds. Although, to give the Catholic Church credit, after some initial reservations, it took almost 100 years. The Catholic Church made the leap and got its own official printing press in 1580, so it could disseminate its own message. That's not really 100 years at that time. Technology took a long time to embed itself. So that's not as bad as it sounds. But I have to point out that in 1559, the Catholic Church had already compiled a list of prohibited books. So you see, Google isn't the first. First, they prohibited the books, and then they started pumping out stuff they wanted people to read. And that's, we're sort of in between there at the time. Google is at the moment prohibiting various sites and connections, and in a little while, it's going to start publishing its own propaganda, I suppose you could call it. Well, let's skip forward to this comment about surrounding our children with violent images. It's possible it's actually Trump's opinion, but whether it's his or one of his spin doctors, it's obviously a knee-jerk reaction to a terrible situation, because people are casting round for something to blame and they can't get at guns, so they're going to have a go at video games. But it's sort of profitable for the media to have a go at video games, like Socrates, who had an investment in dialogue. So media have an investment in broadcast media rather than video games. What I want to talk about really is the tendency of people, when they're struck by a horrible situation, they want to find something to blame. Because not blaming something looks like they don't care about it. In Britain, after a mass shooting in the primary school of a Scottish town called Dunblane, the government went into a paroxysm of gun confiscation. And although guns were strictly controlled before that time, afterwards they're more or less banned altogether. And even at the time, even though I was horrified, and even though I'm no gun enthusiast, I thought the government was doing the wrong thing, because laws passed out of panic are never good laws. They can never be good laws. And I don't know why, but in America, the whole system seems particularly susceptible to moral panics. We can go right back to Salem, of course, but we can also look closer to this time at the great comic book purge of 1954. An eminent psychiatrist named Frederick Wertham published a book in which he proved that the violent imagery in comic books was causing psychological harm and antisocial behaviour in children. It turns out that the cases he quoted were almost exclusively of children who already had psychiatric problems, and in one case he actually made the whole thing up. Yeah, there's no doubt that he believed what he was doing was for the greater good, but still he was dishonest, and his conclusions were based on a set of lies. So why did that happen? Why did he compromise his career in that way? Why did the media of the time jump on his results with such enthusiasm? Well, there are two possible scenarios, which I'm going to put before you. If anyone has another suggestion, comments, that's what the comments section is there for. So the first one is that the great comics scare came in 1954, just after the McCarthy drumhead courts were petering out, and it wasn't fashionable to worry about the Red Menace anymore. So it looks like people were just casting about for something else to be scared about. It could be that. But I've got another suggestion, which I suppose you already have worked out by now. Television was becoming the dominant entertainment. And the problem with television in those early years was that the images were quite statically filmed. The cameras were bulky, so you couldn't move them about a lot. Some shows had a setup. It was invented for I Love Lucy, actually. It was called the 3-camera setup or something like that. And you had 3 cameras working together, and then you'd switch from one shot to another to add some interest. But still, many shows were photographed face on, like you were sitting in front of them in a chair. Also, the screens were monochrome, not black and white. They were shades of grey, weren't they? There's nothing wrong with that. It was magic at the time, but it wasn't like a comic book. In comics, at least some of the pictures were coloured. The artwork was often truly amazing. I very much admire a lot of comic book artwork. And the angles were, even the black and white stuff was good, and the angles were always unusual and interesting. And of course, the scenarios they depicted were at the time impossible for TV to replicate. Even films would have had trouble with some of them. And the Superman show of the 50s is a case in point. It was most unconvincing. People flying, bursting through walls, explosions, and even huge crowds. You just couldn't do that on TV. And that's apart from the fact that TV programmes had set times and time limits, while comic books could be accessed at any time and again at will. I've no doubt that the huge comic book industry posed a serious challenge to television, at least in the minds of the television executives and their masters in the advertising industry. Now, I'm not saying that Frederick Wertham was in the pay of the TV industry. I haven't seen anything written about that, but his findings certainly would have reduced the competition. Just like Socrates' findings, if he'd had his way, would have stifled the competition from writing. And just like Abbot Trithemius's opinions would have stifled the competition from printing. And I think we've got a similar situation here. Video games, the media has jumped on the bandwagon. They can't get at guns, so they're taking advantage of this video game business to try and stifle the competition that video games are giving to the MSM. After all, even MMA is considered quite lowbrow, but why watch that when you can play fighting games first person with anyone in the world online at any time? So let's get back to Thoth. Remember what I said about the legend that he created himself out of words, and remember chapter 1, verse 1 of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word. And then the Word was made flesh. Irrespective of our religious beliefs, that sentence acknowledges something important in human history. We start with words and then we make the words into reality. That's what the MSM and various political factions are trying to do with Trump, for instance. They keep on repeating these words, trying to make them into a reality. They're saying Trump called Nazis fine people, for instance. I heard somebody say that when Trump spoke about flying a flag until August the 8th, that was a dog whistle because the number 8 is the letter H in the alphabet, and he was talking about Hitler. I'm not kidding. And then some Nicole, somebody or other, said on MSNBC that Trump was talking about exterminating Latinos. It's just straight out lies, but it's masquerading as news. And they're trying to make out of words some sort of reality. And just like the MSM are trying to make video games into the same sort of monster that many of them are trying to make of Trump. You've got to be very careful of words, you know. Oh, and just as a rider to that, when my kids were the sort of age when they were interested in video games, they played Grand Theft Auto all the time. I didn't know much about such games when they were playing them, and I just wandered in one day and stood over my son's shoulder and watched him, and I was horrified. I thought this was terrible, and I really was truly worried about the effect it would have on their future mentalities. On the other hand, I knew there was no way I could stop it, so if I'd have banned it, they'd have found some other way of accessing it. So I let them play, they just played Grand Theft Auto. And do you know, to my astonishment, none of them has turned into a murderous antisocial boy racer. So what can I say? I believe Sargon was quite a gamer as well. And he didn't turn out too badly, did he? Click on like, it really does help with the algorithm. Then click on subscribe and then on the bell. Sometimes you may find your subscription has lapsed without your knowledge, so keep on checking that button. Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe, and if you wish to donate, click the Subscribe Star link where you can make a one-off payment or set up a regular contribution, or I have a PayPal account at grannyopteryx@gmail.com. Till next time.